Hey, so this is video 2 for the skull bones, and I always save these last 2 bones for the end, and that's because they have a lot of structures that you have to know, and they're a little bit tricky. The sphenoid and the ethmoid bone are bones that make up most of the inside of our skull. So I always do these separately after we go through the rest of the list. And so let's get a start on these. It's not as bad as you think, even though there's a bunch of structures for that sphenoid bone. It's pretty easy to identify as long as you take the time to review it. So I'm going to get rid of myself here, and I'm going to scooch over to where my list is. We're going to start with our sphenoid bone. And if you look at the sphenoid bone, it's got some different parts to it. It says we have the greater wing, the lesser wing. Then we have the Celaturcica hypophyseal fossa, optic foramen, and then this thing called the Paragoid process. Again, I'm going to just use some pictures to show you this. First of all, I want to kind of orient you to where this sphenoid bone is. So I'm going to go back to my pictures here. The sphenoid bone, like I said, makes up a lot of the inside of your skull. So when you're looking at the outside layers of the skull, you don't really see a whole lot of it. All right, the best place to see it is on the side of your skull, and there's this section right here. See this little rectangle that's red? That is a portion of your sphenoid bone. This is really the only part that you're going to see on the outside. So it's right in front, or directly kind of in between our temporal bone and our frontal bone. Okay, so this is the outer portion of our sphenoid bone. If you look at it on the inside, if you look at it from the front, on the inside of your eyeball sockets, it also makes up this area directly on the back of your eyeball socket. So this yellow portion on this picture is your sphenoid bone. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about the bottom of your skull, the inferior aspect of your skull. The sphenoid bone kind of cuts across, and so it's this orange area. The orange area is all sphenoid bone. This is the only place that you really see a lot of the sphenoid bone from the outside. Now, most of these structures, if we go back to the list, you're going to see it says greater wing, lesser wing, Celaturcica hypophyseal fossa. These are all actually on the inside of your skull. So what we need to do to really see the sphenoid bone is we need to take the top off the skull. And this is actually why our skulls come apart. So if you look at the inside of the skull from the top, this red bone is all sphenoid bone. See, it makes up most of the inside of your skull. Now, if I take this, almost all of the terms that you need to know are on the inside of this. So I'm going to zoom in. Let me zoom in, and we'll identify most of those structures. Now, the list says you have to know the greater wing and lesser wing of the sphenoid bone. Well, if you look at the sphenoid bone from the top, if you use your imagination, it kind of looks like a bat. So like the center portion here is the body of the bat, and then it looks like you've got bat wings that are coming off of the sphenoid bone. The wings of the bat are separated into the greater and lesser wing. The lesser wing is this ridge. See the ridge coming off? That's the lesser wing of the sphenoid bone. And then below it, there's kind of a low area. This area below that ridge, the lesser wing, is the greater wing. So you have the lesser wing as the ridge, the greater wing as this low area. So those are the two wings of the sphenoid bone. Now the body of the bat is a structure that looks a lot like a saddle. In fact, it's named the Turkish saddle in Latin, the sella turcica. So the sella turcica is the body of the bat. It looks like a saddle. The entire structure is the sella turcica. Now, the sella turcica has a seat to the saddle. So this seat, just the seat, is called the hypophyseal fossa. So you have the sella turcica making up the bat's body. That's the whole structure. It looks like a saddle. And then the seat of the saddle. The saddle's seat is called the hypophyseal fossa. And it's the hypophyseal fossa that holds your pituitary gland. Another name for the pituitary gland is the hypophysis. And so your hypophyseal fossa holds your hypophysis, or the pituitary gland. Okay, so that is, I think, 4 of the 6 structures that you have to know on the sphenoid bone. The other 2 structures we can actually see from the outside of the skull. One of them is pretty easy. It's the optic foramen. The optic foramen is the foramen that allows your optic nerve to go from your eyeball to your brain. And it is this right here. So right where my cursor is the optic foramen. Disregard these slits. Your eyeball sockets also have these slits. They're called fissures. They're not on the list. You don't need to know them. What you need to identify is this rounded optic foramen that holds your optic nerve. All right? And then the final structure on the sphenoid bone, we're going to see from the bottom. And if you look at the bottom, kind of behind where your teeth are, remember on this diagram, the orange bone is your sphenoid bone. There are some flaps that are hanging down behind your mouth. These flaps right here are called the Paragoid Processes. You can also see them from the lateral view. Well, sort of, without the mandibles kind of in the way. But see, there's a flap right here that is the sphenoid bone hanging down. This is the pterygoid processes. We could see them better if the mandible wasn't on there. I think I've got a picture. Yeah, right here. So this flap hanging down behind your mouth is the pterygoid process. All right, they're just right here. So okay, so that takes care of our sphenoid bone. Woohoo! So we've got the sphenoid bone, and just make sure you look at the different structures. Almost always they'll just ask you on the test the structures. Gosh, I don't know if I've ever seen on the test where you would just say, that's the sphenoid bone. They always want you to name those structures. And since you don't see a lot of the sphenoid bone from the outside of your skull, they don't usually put a sticker on the sphenoid bone and ask you just for the sphenoid bone. All right, now the final bone of the skull is a bone called the ethmoid bone. And so the ethmoid bone is also one of these bones that makes up kind of the inside of your skull. And so I'll show you where this ethmoid bone is. We can just see a little portion of it kind of from the outside. And then there are 4 structures, 3, that you really need to know. Remember, these nasal concha are those nose flaps. So I'm not having you differentiate superior, inferior. You just have to know nasal conchae. So what you really need to know are just 3 terms: the perpendicular plate, the crista galli, and then the cribiform plate. Again, these are structures that are on the inside of your skull. So let's go back to our picture here. And the ethmoid bone is a bone that kind of lies right behind your nose. And so if we look at this skull without its top, remember that pink bone is the sphenoid bone. This yellow bone is your frontal bone, one of the bones that we talked about in class. One of the things you have to think about is that all these bones of the cranium, they're not only on the outside, they're on the inside too. So you've got your frontal bone, and then the orange is the temporal bone, and then the green here is your parietal bone, and then the brown is the occipital bone. Well, if you notice, the yellow frontal bone, the middle isn't yellow. It is kind of a tan color. This tan area is your ethmoid bone. So the ethmoid bone kind of is surrounded by that frontal bone. Now, remember in the last video, I talked about this nasal septum. And I told you that the bottom of the nasal septum is made up of this bone called the vomer. The rest of the nasal septum, the divider that's on the upper portion, that divider is part of the ethmoid bone. And the area that hangs down off the ethmoid bone that makes up this upper part of your nasal septum is called the perpendicular plate. So the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone makes up the top part of your nasal septum. The vomer makes up the bottom. Now, if you look, you can't really see anything else of the ethmoid bone. There's a little bit of the ethmoid bone that you can see in your orbitals, but they'll never put a tag on that on the test. A side view, well, let's go up and look at the side view. See, there's just a little bit of that ethmoid bone behind the lacrimal bone. Posterior to the lacrimal bone, you'll see a little bit of that ethmoid bone. They never put that on the test. What you got to know are the structures, right? So the perpendicular plate makes up the nasal septum. And then if we take the skull cap off, we have to know these 2 structures here. Now, my picture isn't great, but if you look at a skull, you're going to notice that the top of the ethmoid bone is made up of a flat area and then this ridge that sticks up right in the middle. Now, the flat portion is called the cribiform plate. Like a crib, it's flat. Babies lay on a crib. This is a flat crib. It's got all these holes in it. All these little foramen are all in the cribiform plate. Then the ridge that sticks up in the middle, that ridge is called the crista galli. And it's actually, the crista galli is, its function is kind of an anchor. There's a part of your brain that attaches to the crista galli, kind of holds the brain in place, helps stabilize, just the movement of the brain. So this crista galli is this ridge that's sticking up, and it's sitting on this flat base called the cribiform plate. All right, and that's all you need to know. Now, there is a nasal conchae that's associated with the ethmoid bone. Don't worry about it. Remember that your nasal conchae are just your nose flaps. You don't have to tell me superior, inferior, or medial. I don't care about that. And so it's kind of redundant, so you can just kind of scratch off, cross out that that nasal conchae under ethmoid bone. All right, so we are now done with the skull. So we've covered all the major bones of the skull. Next week, we are going to continue on, and we're going to go into the vertebrae, ribs, and then we'll talk about the appendicular skeleton with the arms and legs. And that's going to wrap up test number 1. So make sure that you keep going over and reviewing the skull bones, because you're going to have a good portion of the test will be the skull. All right, so I will see you in class. Have a great rest of your day.